would say, for instance, okay, I have an SRC directory, and in there is an application.js which most likely requires plenty of other stuff. And please Sprocketize that and put that in a dist JavaScript application.js, and whatever assets you encounter along the way, put those recursively in the dist directory. That's what the -a dist says. If I hadn't specified an asset root, it wouldn't copy the assets met through the provide directives. You can use that from within Ruby code. So because it's a Ruby API anyway, so that's quite simple. The main entry point is called Sprockets secretary, and you provide basically the same thing, except you can use globbing. You can use especially double star globbing, which is not necessarily available in your shell. And then grab the concatenation, save that anywhere, and you have a special install assets as well to install that asset, all the assets in the assets root directory. So sometimes, well, you don't know Ruby or you can't use Ruby. And for instance, you're in the PHP world, like so many. And therefore, you would need something else. So what you can do is use a CGI script that does all this for you. Say you have that tree. So we have something that kind of looks a Rails application. We have a Sprockets YAML file somewhere up there in the config directory. We have our base JavaScript in JavaScript up there, and we have so that all of those are defaults assumed by the CGI script, which is why I'm going with the convention here, but you could customize the script. And then we have a vendor directory with Sprockets, and in there one directory per Sprocket and SRC subdirectories, and you can have assets subdirectories as well and stuff like that. And you can actually configure all this through the Sprockets YAML file. So the Sprockets YAML file will say what the load path is. So here the load path is the JavaScript directory plus vendor Sprockets, anything SRC. And the source files, the sources that I'm going to want to parse here are my site JS first and foremost, and then any other JS after that, if any. And I want that to be outputted to public Sprockets JS. So that's what I would want. And you write this, and then you have, well, some configuration to do that. So for instance, this is Apache configuration, and you would just say, obviously, I want to execute CGIs and add the handlers and stuff, and say, okay, if I request sprockets.js, either it exists and then everything's fine, or it doesn't exist, and then I'm going to rewrite that internally through a pass-through to my CGI script. And I'm going to, there's a small environment variable that you can put in there, which tells the script to actually save its output to the Sprockets.js, so it's cached after the first request. And all you have to do in your source is basically just call /sprockets.js, which will pass through to a CGI script and do the concatenation on the fly. And obviously that nph sprockets CGI, it's provided by the script. So I wanted to show you a couple things. Here's the Sprockets directory. So wait a second, where's my mouse? Here. So that's the Sprockets stuff, and I actually have such projects, and I wanted to show you. So you have all installation details in that script, and that script is basically provided by within Sprockets. So you in the ext subdirectory, so you can use that, and it does all the work for you. It's just a Ruby script basically, and it does all that work for you. And it's provided so by Sprockets, and that's pretty neat in and of itself. Obviously, if you're in the Rails world, as Sam Stephenson is, and as many of us are likely to be, you have an extra level of candy, which is the Sprockets Rails gem, right? Which is provided as well by Sam. And what Sprockets Rails does is it's a plugin. You just install it, or use the same module if you want to. And all you have to do really is in your root configuration add that simple call that will do all the mapping for you. And then instead of using your regular JavaScript include tags, you just use a Sprockets include tag, and that's it. And it will do the entire concatenation. For this, it uses a config Sprockets YAML file in your config directory in Rails, which does pretty much the same stuff as we saw with the CGI script. And except that you don't have to do all the Apache configuration and stuff, because Rails does the routing. You just route like this. And it will handle all the caching, distributing. It provides rake tasks to install the assets and to pre-compile that script and put it in your source repository for you if you want to. You could do that, for instance, if you deploy with Capstrainer, you could do that on a cap deploy hook. So every time you deploy, it pre-compiles everything, updates the assets, puts that on your server, on your deployment server, and then you don't have to worry about a thing. So that's awesome. Recently, I was fortunate enough to do some freelancing for Thomas on Freckle, and Thomas came back to me and said, you know what would be awesome? It's to bind that with really good JavaScript compression so that we can squeeze even more size out of it and not stop at regular concatenation. So yeah, indeed, just because it's one big file doesn't mean it's one small file, which is a really weird sentence. I'm really happy with it. And we have something called YUI Compressor. And YUI Compressor is arguably the best source shrinker out there currently. It's 100% safe, and despite that, it has a lot of optimizations. And the documentation we use on Sprockets Rails and the YUI Compressor wrappers and stuff just mention a couple options, like the munge options, for instance, which just shortens local variable names. But there are plenty of optimizations that you can use. It currently seems to be better and yield better results than stuff like JSMean or ShrinkSafe, which is Dojo's compressor or packer, stuff like that. And one of the good things about it is, unless you really, really insist on it, it doesn't obfuscate. And you should not obfuscate your code, ever, because it makes debugging hell, among other things. And it's not necessary. I mean, the compression you're going to get through obfuscation anyway is, you can beat the crap out of that by gzipping, for instance, so it doesn't make sense. It's distributed as a jar file. So one of the small constraints you have is that you're going to have some form of GRE installed, which is pretty straightforward on any platform. But so there's a gem wrapper, which again was provided by Sam. This is YUI Compressor page. You've got plenty of information on it. It's part of the Yahoo Developer Network. And Sam has a small Ruby wrapper. He actually put that together, I think, this summer, right? It has a small Ruby wrapper that wraps the YUI Compressor and lets us access that really easily through Ruby, which is awesome. And you just install that, and you can access the various kinds of compression. And what's of specific interest to us right now is the JavaScript compressor. And here's an example option, actually, among many, which is munge, which just tells it to shorten local variable names, which has no impact whatsoever. And you can tell that it does that. It does a few things like replacing a square bracket member access when it's static by period notation, stuff like that. So it actually compresses really well. And you can also specify, the code in the middle goes with the defaults, but you can specify stuff like which Java interpreter you want to run, and where the jar file is located. By default, it assumes a number of things, like the jar file is in the same directory as the gem, stuff like that. But you can, and also notice that YUI Compressor does a lot of things, not only JavaScript, it does CSS and stuff, so we could actually use that as well to compress like CSS assets or stuff like that. Yeah, it is. It's distributed along with the gem because, well, it's licensed in a way that lets us do that. So you don't have to install YUI on one side and YUI Compressor on one side and the gem on the other side. It's pretty self-contained. So incidentally, this thing is currently in production on Freckle, for instance. And here's a sample configuration. It's very, very similar to what we saw earlier, except there is this new compress option, and compress can basically be just true, or it can be a hash of options that are passed directly to the YUI Compressor gem, which usually passes them directly to the YUI Compressor library. I think I have, I mentioned Freckle. Freckle is this. Freckle rules. Freckles let mostly freelancers deal with their time in a non-obtrusive, efficient way. And it has this run, so you can see the Sprockets JS out there. It's my YUI Compressor and stuff. So it's great. And once you've done that, you've got all your JavaScript. It's neatly structured. You can use constants. It's easily maintainable. You have far less merging issues, especially if you're unfortunate enough not to use Git. And you're, for instance, with Subversion, and merges are usually, more often than not, fail for stupid reasons. So you have this comfort of using a properly structured tree to whatever degree of depth you want. I think we have, close to 60 JavaScript files on Freckle, and at 3 or 4 levels of depth. And it's compressed, it's minified. Well, it's not compressed, it's minified in the best possible way. It's consolidated at one thing, the file is outputted and stuff. It's great. So what's left for us to optimize? Well, for instance, you could tweak your assets HTTP server. You could gzip, for instance, which usually beats the crap out of any kind of wire compression you're going to be able to do. And you could cache, you could configure your server and whatever reverse proxies or whatever you have to cache the heck out of it on the client side. And if necessary, if you decide it's worth it, you could actually upload mainstream libs that you use to the Google Ajax API system, which we'll see in a moment. That, again, is not necessarily what you systematically want to use, because these guys have some form of latency themselves. Here's an example Apache configuration. It's actually taken straight out of Thomas' book, JavaScript Performance Rocks. And here we mostly say, like the very basics, like any kind of text resource basically should be compressed. Expiry should be active, and it should be really far away. And to change that, we're just going to change names. When we use Rails application, Rails automatically adds a timestamp, which is mtime based, at the end of any asset anyway. So we would have timestamps at the end of all of our assets, and if they change, we're going to just bypass cache, because the resource doesn't feel like it's the same at all, even name-wise, which lets us put really long expiry times. Here also you see that, well, cache control is public. By default, cache control is most often private. I think it's Rails default at that point, which is good for stuff like banking or stuff where you really want to ensure it's not going to be cached, especially by reverse proxies. But here we're going like, okay, let's let reverse proxies mostly cache the hell out of this, which is great for increasing throughput while reducing the stress on your application server. And we are killing any sort of e-tags. The reason for this is that e-tags are really dependent on the kind of HTTP server you're using, and some of them are going to use weird local stuff, like the local IP and stuff, to use e-tags. And so when you start distributing your assets among a CDN or whatever, every single node will have different e-tags when it's the same resource. So we prefer just work with the file name and whatever mtime we're going to have on the files, and rely on the good old if modified since, not modified logic. So here are a few numbers. It's pretty hard to reproduce, but for instance, on just the example I pulled with just prototype, the effects part of Scriptaculous and a very tiny application script, it originates at close to 300K. And when it's consolidated in one file, YUI compressed, and gzipped, it goes to almost just 10% of that. So that's quite significant. As far as HTTP requests go, well, either we play like the old way, we have those massive files, and that's going to be, in my example, just 3 files, which is way under what actual applications use. Or let's say we have a very significant application, or not necessarily significant, but we use like the structured split source approach that can go quickly in many tens of files. At the end, with this optimization applied, there's only one file. There's only one JavaScript with everything consolidated in it. Obviously, that means that you code your JavaScript in a way that every single pod detects whether it's applicable to the current page or not. And otherwise, obviously.
It's like one thing that's very interesting, I think, is if you like do the concatenation first,
yeah.
and then do the unification,
yeah.
You get better results.
Yeah, because the dictionary is better. The dictionary is better, basically. So obviously the compression works better. And here's a load time that with unprimed cache. So on that thing, considering I went with the massive amount of files, and we have a huge accumulated latency, basically just latency. And that was on a page that didn't do anything outside loading the scripts. No images, no CSS. So I wasn't even putting stress with like concurrent HTTP connections. All the HTTP connections that the browser could open were for JavaScript. Even so, I had close to 2 seconds latency on local host, right? So I'll let you do the math with like actual online. And after that, I had close to half a second of actually sending the data. With all optimizations gone, I only have one single latency. That latency is actually higher the first time around because I'm hitting the gzipping online, like on-the-fly gzipping. So I'm actually assuming here that my JavaScript wasn't gzipped yet and wasn't cached on the server side, that I'm like the first client ever. So even in that worst case scenario client side, I'm still having barely 1/4 or something of the time on the other side. And with cache prime, well, that's awesome because even with cache primed, if you have a lot of files, you still have to request to the server stuff like, oh, by the way, if not modified since, blah, blah, blah. And so you can still have a lot of latency because of that. And then obviously you have very small data transfer because it's mostly headers saying, oh, not modified and whatever. But you do have a lot of latency. What you do with all the optimizations, including expiry and stuff, is that latency is close to nil. For the simple reason that you say, oh, long expiry, my file name didn't change, so it's going to stay on the server, on the client, and the client's just going to load it for local and parse it and interpret it, and that's going to be ridiculously fast. Obviously, your mileage may vary. That totally depends on your application, but the savings are there. And the factor vary, but the savings are very significant in any case. So I mentioned Google Ajax Libraries API. That is a great idea. Basically, Google just, I think I have something in there. That's the JavaScript performance website. Yeah, those are the Google Ajax Libraries API. Basically, Google maintains a number of recent versions online for most of the dominant libraries. So obviously jQuery, jQuery UI, Prototype, Scriptaculous, soon Script2 when we make it official, MooTools, Dojo, SwiftObject, YUI, the entire thing, Xcore, and recently the Chrome Frame system. So all of this is available through the system. You can either use a JavaScript call to build the script call or just do a regular script call and avoid an extra JavaScript interpretation. The great thing about this is that they do top-notch serving. So they have really good cache configuration, expiry, they do massive JZipping, and they have a CDN. So from that point of view, Wieslow would say, yay, on many aspects, and you get an A. But the thing is, this is Google CDN. This is the same Google CDN that sometimes lets us have like a 5-second latency on Google Analytics trackers, right? So some. What?
It's not the same server as Google.
Right, it's not the same, but I mean, in the end, you get the same kind of potential long latency. It's on their architecture, and they don't make any guarantee of like really uber fast serving, and they don't have to. I mean, they're just providing that as a convenience for us, which is great enough. The good thing about this, what's really interesting about this though, is that you're gonna pay that latency the first time you query that thing, and then you have really long expiry. And so what's interesting with that is that if enough people use that on their websites, odds are that your user probably went already recently to a website that used that same library you do through the Google Ajax API. And so he already has that URL in and cached. And so you're not going to have to load it at all. You're going to benefit from that shared cache system, and it's going to be uber fast. I'd like to say thank you to Sam, because this is a good pick, isn't it? This is from July. This is all thanks to him. He's been working on that on whatever spare time he has, if any. So this is all open source. This is all in GitHub. You're more than invited to forking it and play with it. There are a few things that are on my forks currently, like the Sprockets Rails YUI Compressor binding is not yet in the official Sprockets Rails. It's just in my fork, and Sam has to do some review with it. And with that, and this very tiny audience, it's really weird. I'll just say thank you, and if you have any questions, probably not you. Probably not anyone, actually. The odds are that, yeah.
About the CGI conversion.
Yeah.
You told us some configurations to YAML.
Right.
Could we use variables into HTTP requests?
Not in the current version now. Well, plus that would be kind of weird. But yeah, if you needed that, you would just have to patch the CGI file. Yeah, I can see what you mean. Well, the CGI is just Ruby source, so you can definitely tweak it to whatever needs you have and look at the HTTP params and tweaking that, probably filter on the remote IP and stuff like that, and HTTP basic authentication maybe in that case, and have it tweak however you want. Yeah, or you could just like upload a new Sprockets YAML and then go. But that's what it is.
I think almost like a very important mention is that it doesn't assume anything about your JavaScript. So you can use
At all.
with any JavaScript.
Yeah.
It's like doesn't care about frameworks.
Yeah, it's done by Sam, but it has no relation whatsoever to prototype or anything. It's like really basic JavaScript.
I'm pretty sure like people use it already.
Mm-hmm.
Someone did like a PHP implementation.
Yeah.
Is there, so you have the little YAML file that you can do substitution with, but is there any sort of like templating support?
Any what?
Sort of like templating support?
No, it's. I think internally it works with the ERB to just change that. But aside from that, I don't think there's any specific template feature. But since it's ERB, though, technically you can put. No, actually, because it's going to. I would have to check on that. Yeah, it's either it's ERB and technically it is Ruby code, so you could do whatever, or it's just parsing for that small snippet, that small, less than person equal snippet, and replacing from a hash. But I think it's ERB actually, and so that you could do loops or interpolation or anything. I'm actually, let me just check that out very quickly. There's no require ERB, so that sounds like constant. Oh, well, yeah, but that's just Sprockets, so I would have to, let me just open a quick Sprocket source. That's actually not going to be on that session, so I'm going to have multiple users on that thing. Gonna tell you that right away. Yeah. Sprockets. Yeah. So the way it interpolates, there's a preprocessor. Now it doesn't use ERB, so it's most likely just, yeah, it's just a gsub call. So currently it wouldn't let you do any significant, yeah, there's a small interpolate constant call, and it does a gsub. So, and pulls from a hash. So currently it doesn't do anything like that, but indeed, especially as it's Ruby based, you could just pull off ERB and do an ERB eval of your stuff. And you would gain the whole interspersing, the whole ability to intersperse Ruby code in your template and get some form of templating because of that. Do you have any specific, like you?
Shipping different versions of jQuery based on the options.
Right.
And you want to be able to do it if defs and strip code out,
Mm-hmm.
if def and be code in, or what have you. And you want to potentially even do a substitution, like taking code from one file and inserting it into another file.
Right.
So
Yeah, so stuff that you could, that you could do with like load or regular load codes and stuff like that. Yeah, I see what you mean. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Either that or one primitive form of that would be to just use that to switch between several configuration files, but the just file concatenation, file selection. And to get finer grained, yes, we need stuff like ifdef or whatever, and specific, well, and then we'll just have our includes, or regular include codes.
Like, one thing to say about it, the concatenation itself is pretty fast, so we can like very easily work with it. So better like everything. Stuff that was built on the fly. You can like see much of the delay, except if you use the unification, that's just work.
are there any plans to do closure gem?
Mm-hmm. All right, well, thank you for having been the elite group in this session. And
So, I mean, a lot of this stuff we do already, jQuery. The problem is that, I mean, so we already have it done, it's working.
mhm.
It's working both as a make file and as build XML. So, I mean, two different ways.
One short, one long then.
I mean, with the make file becomes significantly faster. But,
Yeah.
I mean, I guess my biggest limitation at the moment is just that this seems nice, but you know, it's introducing a whole bunch of new differences. Like we already depend upon Java
Right.
implementation.
But then you would depend on Ruby and Ruby gems, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, Ruby Gems next project.
Yeah. Which are, however, today mostly installed by default on just about any distribution. But I see where you're going. Yeah.
I mean, so yeah, I don't know. But I like it. I don't know. I think it's we should be using it.
It does help. I don't know how they. Well, you do have a build process today because you're already cutting your source down and slicing and dicing and then building it back up again. And it reminds me of the early days of MooTools where their main selling point was like, oh, you can just grab whatever and we're going to concatenate it for you. And now we're, I think any time you go into real world application that actually depends heavily on JavaScript, well, you're going to need that. Currently, like, 37 signals mostly does regular full concatenation. They have this big old .js thing provided by Rails. And then the cache, they just cache it and have on the fly gzipping by Apache, but they don't have required, they don't have anything. They have to basically explicitly grab everything by alphabetical order and put that in there. And there's no actual require system. There's no provide.